Welcome to part one of my presentation on the intellectual history of the Restoration Movement. Much of the material I'm presenting in this series is based on this book titled Origins of the Restoration Movement, an Intellectual History by Richard Tristano. This book is out of print, and a used hard copy is very expensive. However, one can download the full text on a PDF for free, courtesy of Abilene Christian University. Simply Google the title and author of this book. In your query, you may want to add full text PDF and ACU for Abilene Christian University. I was maybe 13 years old when my father and a church friend went golfing one Saturday morning. An older gentleman came there ready to golf alone. The golf pro there told him he would have to join a group of others. Seeing that there were three of us, the golf pro put the older gentleman in our group. Throughout the course of those 9 holes, the older gentleman learned that we were Church of Christ. At one point, my father and his friend were farther down the fairway. Alone with the old man, he took the opportunity to say quite clearly, "You need to learn your history." He didn't specify what he meant by that, but somehow I knew what he was talking about. Of course, he told me to study my religious heritage. At that adolescent age, having been born and raised Church of Christ, some aspects of my church's teachings didn't add up. I was told we were the first century church established on the day of Pentecost in 33 AD in Jerusalem, as narrated in Acts 2. Our founding was not based on the Restoration movement or the Stone Campbell movement. That was merely a restoration of the New Testament church. Rather, our church was founded in 33 AD when the first 3,000 Christians were baptized. The true church was underground for approximately 1,700 years. Every now and then, perhaps, someone simply read the New Testament plainly and got everything right to go to heaven. The church was underground for approximately 1,700 years. Every now and then, perhaps, someone simply read the New Testament plainly and got everything right to go to heaven. Over time, I began to wonder what happened to all those poor people between the first century and the early 19th century who were never a part of the one true church that was ours. What if they couldn't read? What if they were never exposed to someone else who got it right? I guess they were out of luck. It wasn't until my early 20s that I began to study the history of the Restoration movement. I didn't immediately take that old man's advice, but it was instilled in me at an early age. It simply became easier to study that history as an adult, having had more education and having become more autonomous in making my own decisions. In this first lesson, I'd like to discuss these events that led to the Restoration movement. It is generally understood that the Protestant Reformation began in the year 1517 when the German Augustinian monk Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses, or set of grievances against the Roman Church, to the door of the parish in Wittenberg, Germany. As we know, the Protestant Reformation disrupted Christianity in the Western world. Some will say for good, others will say for ill. But the point here is this dramatic movement that affects us to this day. After years of religious wars, we see a move in Europe toward religious tolerance within Christianity. We have the Peace of Westphalia within the Holy Roman Empire in 1648, the Toleration Act in England of 1688, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen during the French Revolution in 1789. The opening of these doors to religious toleration would eventually lead to the tolerance of many Christian movements resulting in the United States. So let's take a closer look at this religious history in Europe prior to the Restoration movement in America. The religious landscape prior to the Protestant Reformation of the early 16th century, as well as prior to the laws of religious tolerance that followed after horrific wars, prohibited the church shopping we know very well today in the 21st century. Prior to the Protestant Reformation, you were automatically a Catholic in communion with the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. Until religious toleration in the Holy Roman Empire, your free will to choose which form of Christianity reflected Christ's church most closely was highly compromised by war. Or being a Jesuit priest attempting to win souls back to Rome under Elizabeth I in England was a highly dangerous endeavor likely to end in a gruesome execution. For the faithful in England still loyal to Rome, refusing to attend the Church of England services on Sundays resulted in steep fines. Fortunately, we don't have a state church here in the United States. Having one would be quite foreign to our way of thinking today. But those living prior to the religious toleration wouldn't understand not having a church. They wouldn't understand our separation of church and state. Instead, they knew if they espoused any views contrary to those of the state church, they would be tried by the church and handed over to the state for the dirty work of punishing the offender. So the question must be asked, how did Luther avoid being burned at the stake? That's a fair question, considering that Jan Hus, a Czech priest, was burned at the stake in 1415, 102 years before Luther nailed his 95 Theses. His Hussite movement was a precursor to the Protestant Reformation. The answer for Luther's survival is simple: politics. He was protected by his sovereign, Frederick III, one of the seven electors within the Holy Roman Empire. Frederick ruled the Saxony region. An elector elects the next emperor in this empire, consisting mainly of Central Europe. This form of government was established by the Golden Bull of 1356. Although Frederick III died a Catholic, he protected his subjects against Charles V, the Catholic emperor. Rome was also despised by these locals as Rome's clergymen sold indulgences and moved the funds back to the Eternal City. These indulgences funded the construction of today's St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican City state. As a funny aside here, I wanted to include a quote from the French philosopher Voltaire. Quote, "The Holy Roman Empire is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire." Sola Scriptura, or the Bible alone, is our key takeaway from Luther's Reformation. Surprisingly for us with a Church of Christ background, Christians centuries ago didn't subscribe to the Bible as its sole authority. Instead, the teaching magisterium, Latin for master, of the Roman Church ruled the Christian West. In an age where we are familiar with sola scriptura as our authority rather than fallible man, the mentality of our ancestors was the exact opposite. It must also be considered that the scriptures weren't accessible to the general public, which for the most part was highly illiterate. Let's also not forget that the printing press wasn't invented until the mid 15th century. Let's begin to take a look at the first set of laws in Europe that protected Christians whose faith differed with that of their respective princes. First, in 1648, we have the Peace of Westphalia. This ended the 30 Years' War of 1618 to 1648, in which 8 million had died. This peace gave the prince of the region cuius regio, which is the ability to determine his region's faith. However, those whose faith differed were allowed to practice it privately. It also put Catholicism, Lutheranism, and Calvinism on an equal footing. Second, there was the Tolerance Act of 1688 in England. This was the result that followed the Glorious Revolution, in which the Catholic James II was deposed by his daughter Mary II and her husband, the Dutchman William III of Orange. Much later, in 1789, is the Declaration of the Rights of Man of the Citizen, passed by the National Constituent Assembly of France during that nation's revolution. Article 10 of that document states the following: "No one shall be interfered with for his opinions, even religious ones, provided that his practice does not disturb the public order as established by the law." For our next part in the series, we will be discussing John Locke and his influence on Alexander Campbell. We will discuss Locke's views on the practice of religion, as well as his influential ideas on how we come to know, that is, his epistemology. As we'll see, his views greatly influenced the Church of Christ that we know today.